I've always been a fan of Subway sandwiches, you know? It's a quick and easy meal when you're on the go or just don't feel like cooking. So, this one night, I decided to grab a sandwich on my way home from work. It was a typical day, nothing out of the ordinary, and I just wanted to unwind with some food and maybe a movie later. The Subway I usually go to is in this quiet strip mall, not too crowded even during peak hours, which is something I like about it. It was around 8 p.m., not too late, but dark enough outside that the place was mostly empty. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed was how unusually quiet it was. Normally there's some background noise, people talking, the sound of the toaster oven, maybe some music playing softly, but not tonight. It was almost eerie how silent it was. The only person I saw was this guy behind the counter. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with a shaved head and a sort of blank expression on his face. Not the usual friendly staff I'm used to seeing there. I walked up to the counter and gave him a polite nod. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a second longer than felt comfortable. I brushed it off and started ordering my usual, a foot-long turkey on wheat, all the veggies. As I listed off the toppings, he moved mechanically, like he was on autopilot or something. He didn't even ask if I wanted it toasted, just put it through the toaster without a word. His movements were precise, almost too precise, like he'd done this 1,000 times but was only half paying attention. I tried making some small talk, commenting on how quiet it was tonight, but he just looked at me with those empty eyes and nodded. No smile, no acknowledgement, nothing. It was like talking to a statue. I felt this weird tension in the air, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the guy was having a bad day or something. When he finally handed me the sandwich, he did so without a word, just slid it across the counter. I thanked him, but he didn't respond, just turned his back and started cleaning up the counter, wiping it down with slow, deliberate strokes. The whole thing felt off, but I wasn't about to let it ruin my night. I grabbed my sandwich and looked around for a place to sit. There were a few tables occupied, an older man in the corner reading a newspaper, a couple sitting by the window, but nobody seemed to notice the weird vibe. I found a seat near the door, thinking it'd be easier to leave if things got any weirder. I unwrapped my sandwich and took a bite, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. As I ate, I kept glancing up at the counter. The guy was still there, but now he was just standing behind the register, staring straight ahead, not looking at me specifically, just staring blankly into space. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to focus on my food, but I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. Then, I noticed something even stranger. The other customers, they were all sitting perfectly still, almost like they were frozen. The old man hadn't turned a page in his newspaper the whole time I'd been there, and the couple by the window weren't talking or eating, just sitting there, looking down at their table. It was like I had walked into some kind of weird time warp where everything was stuck on pause. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was I imagining this? Was it some kind of prank? I felt my heart rate pick up, the anxiety starting to creep in. I decided it was time to leave. I wrapped up the rest of my sandwich and got up to throw it away. As I walked past the counter, I glanced at the guy one last time. His eyes followed me, but his face was expressionless, like he was studying me. I pushed the door open and practically bolted to my car, trying to keep my cool but feeling like I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. When I got to my car, I fumbled with my keys for a second, hands shaking, before I finally managed to unlock the door. I got in, locked the doors, and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I looked back at the subway, and that's when I saw it. The guy behind the counter had stepped out and was standing at the entrance, just staring at me through the glass door. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. I started the car and drove off, not even bothering to look back. I just wanted to get home, lock the doors, and forget this whole thing ever happened. When I got home, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it was like a shadow that wouldn't leave me alone. I sat on the couch, turned on the TV, and tried to distract myself, but my mind kept drifting back to that guy and the weird, almost lifeless way he moved. I couldn't stop thinking about the other customers too, how they all seemed off, like they weren't really there or something. A few hours passed and I started to convince myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence and I was reading too much into it. I was tired, it had been a long day, and sometimes our minds play tricks on us, right? I was starting to relax a bit when my phone buzzed with a new message. I picked it up, expecting a friend or maybe a spam message, but it was from an unknown number. The message said, "Did you enjoy your sandwich?" My heart skipped a beat. How did this person know I had a sandwich? My first thought was that it was some kind of marketing ploy, but it felt way too personal. I didn't reply. I just sat there, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of it. After a few minutes, another message came through. This time, it was a picture of me, sitting at the table in Subway, eating my sandwich. I felt my stomach drop. Who the hell took this picture? I hadn't seen anyone else in there except for the few people sitting down, and they hadn't moved the entire time I was there. I started to panic, my mind racing with questions. Was it the guy behind the counter? Was it someone else? Why were they doing this? I got up and double-checked that my apartment door was locked, then went to the window to make sure it was secure. I pulled the curtains shut, feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. I tried calling a friend, but there was no answer. I left a message, my voice shaky, telling them to call me back as soon as they could. I didn't know what else to do, so I just sat there, staring at my phone, waiting for something to happen. Minutes felt like hours, and the silence in my apartment was almost deafening. Then, another message came through. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It was another picture, this time of the front of my apartment building. The caption read, "Nice place." My blood ran cold. They knew where I lived. They had been here, outside my building, watching me. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. They said they'd send someone over, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They told me to stay inside and keep my doors locked. I hung up, feeling a mix of fear and helplessness. The cops came and took my statement. They asked if I had any idea who might be doing this, but I had nothing to tell them. Just the weird guy at Subway and those strange customers. They said they'd look into it and told me to be careful, but that was it. They left, and I was alone again, with nothing but my fear and unanswered questions. For the next few days, I barely left my apartment. I was too scared to go anywhere, especially back to that Subway. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, expecting another message, but none came. I tried to go about my life, but every time I went out, I felt like I was being watched. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside my apartment door. It was faint, like someone was shuffling around in the hallway. My heart started to pound in my chest. I tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything, just the empty hallway. I stood there for a minute, listening, but the noise stopped. I waited, my ear pressed against the door, but there was nothing. I finally went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every little creak and groan of the building making me jump. Just as I was starting to drift off, my phone buzzed again. I grabbed it, my heart racing, and looked at the screen. It was another message from the unknown number. "Look outside," it said. My hands were shaking as I got up and walked to the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked out, but all I could see was the empty street. Then, I noticed something on the sidewalk across the street. It was a small, dark shape, something lying there. I squinted, trying to make it out, and then I realized what it was. It was a Subway sandwich, still wrapped up, lying there on the ground. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was a message, and I didn't want to know what it meant. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of my room, my eyes on the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Morning came, and I was still sitting there, too scared to move. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I never went back to that Subway. I moved a few months later to a different part of town and changed my number. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I can hear that noise outside my door again. And I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. Alright, so this happened a while back, and even now, thinking about it gives me chills. It was one of those regular weeknights, and I was heading back home from work. You know how sometimes you just don't feel like cooking? That was me that night. I decided to swing by the Subway near my place. I'd been there a bunch of times before, so I thought it would be a quick in and out, grab my sandwich and head home kind of deal. But man, I was so wrong. It was around 9:30 p.m., I think. The place wasn't exactly bustling with people. It never really was at that hour. When I pulled into the parking lot, there were only a couple of cars. The lights inside were on, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but you know when you just get that gut feeling? I ignored it though. I mean, it was just a subway, right? I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was how cold it was inside. Not just from the AC, but this weird, unsettling chill in the air. There was only one guy working behind the counter, and I'd never seen him before. Usually it was this older lady who was super friendly, always striking up small talk while making your sandwich. But this guy, he was new. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a scruffy beard and this expressionless face. I gave him a nod and started looking at the menu, even though I already knew what I was going to order. As I stood there, I noticed he wasn't really looking at the menu board or getting ready to take my order. Instead, he was just staring at me. Not in a way that you'd expect from someone waiting to take your order, but in this cold, almost calculating way. It was creepy, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just tired or having a bad day. I stepped up to the counter and placed my order, trying to act casual. He didn't say a word, just started making the sandwich. And it wasn't like the usual quick assembly line process. He was slow, methodical, almost like he was putting on a show. He kept glancing up at me every now and then, and each time our eyes met, it sent a shiver down my spine. As he worked, I tried to break the silence. Just some small talk, you know? Busy night? Or something like that. He just looked at me, this blank stare, and then went back to making the sandwich without saying a word. The whole vibe was just wrong. He finished making the sandwich and wrapped it up, sliding it across the counter to me without a word. I paid, took the sandwich, and mumbled a thanks before heading to one of the tables. I figured I'd just eat there since the place was empty, and it was better than eating alone in my car. I sat down, unwrapped the sandwich, and took a bite. It tasted fine, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. I looked up towards the counter, but the guy was gone. Just like that, he disappeared into the back. The place was dead silent now, and that chill was still hanging in the air. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. I took another bite, but then I heard a noise from the back room. It was faint at first, like something being moved around, but then it got louder. It sounded like metal clanging or something heavy being dragged. My heart started racing. I looked around trying to see if there was anyone else, but the place was completely empty. I thought about leaving, just grabbing my sandwich and getting the hell out of there. But I was curious. Maybe he was just moving some equipment or something, right? I mean, it's not like I was in some horror movie. But the noises kept going, and they were getting closer, like he was moving towards the door to the back room. I kept my eyes on that door, waiting for him to come out, but he didn't. The noises just stopped all of a sudden, and then nothing. Just silence. I sat there, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, after what felt like forever, the door creaked open slowly. He stepped out, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at something in his hand. I couldn't see what it was at first, but then he raised it up, and I realized he was holding a knife. Not a regular kitchen knife, but this huge butcher-style knife. My blood went cold. He finally looked up at me, and this time, there was no blank stare. There was something else in his eyes, something dark, almost like he was enjoying this. He took a step towards me, and that's when I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up so fast I almost knocked over my chair. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, trying to stay calm, trying not to run. But he kept coming towards me, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I could hear his footsteps behind me as I reached the door, my hands shaking as I pushed it open. I practically sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. I got in, locked the doors, and looked up. He was standing at the entrance, just watching me with that knife still in his hand. He didn't come any closer, didn't try to stop me, just watched as I started the car and sped out of the parking lot. I drove around for a while, trying to calm down, my mind racing. What the hell just happened? I couldn't make sense of it. Was he trying to scare me? Was he going to do something? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. I just knew I wasn't going back to that subway anytime soon. I got home, locked all my doors, and tried to shake it off. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? Some guy at Subway looked at me funny with a knife? They'd think I was overreacting or something. So I just tried to forget about it, but it didn't end there. A few days later, I was at a different subway, one further away from my place. I figured it was just a one-time thing, and maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I was ordering my sandwich, I noticed something that made my heart drop. There, on the counter, was a small, handwritten note. It wasn't anything special, just some numbers scribbled down, but it was the same handwriting as on my receipt from that night. I stared at it, my mind racing. What did it mean? Was it just a coincidence? But then I looked closer and realized the numbers were a date and a time. The exact date and time I was at the other subway. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my sandwich and left. I didn't even eat it. I just threw it out and went home, locking myself in my apartment, feeling like I was being watched. For weeks, I was on edge. Every time I passed by a subway, I half expected to see that guy inside, watching me with that knife in his hand. I started avoiding the area completely, taking different routes just to make sure I wouldn't run into him. But I couldn't avoid it forever. One night, I was out with some friends, and we ended up near that same subway. I didn't realize where we were until we were right outside it. I felt my stomach drop, and I made some excuse about needing to go home. As I turned to leave, I glanced inside, and there he was, standing behind the counter, looking right at me with that same expressionless face. I hurried back to my car, my heart racing, and drove home, trying to shake the feeling that he was following me. When I got to my apartment, I went straight to the window and looked outside. I didn't see him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, watching, waiting. A few days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer it, but then I got a text. It was a picture of me, sitting in that subway with the caption, "See you soon." I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report, but without any concrete evidence. It was just my word against nothing. For months, I was paranoid. Every time my phone rang, every time I went outside, I was looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up. I even considered moving, just to get away from that place, that memory. But in the end, I stayed. I told myself it was just some sick game he was playing, trying to scare me. But the fear never really went away. Even now, whenever I go to a subway, I can't help but look around, checking to see if he's there. I don't know what his deal was, or what he wanted, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just hope I never see him again. There was this small subway right around the corner from my office. You know the type, kind of tucked away, not too busy, but reliable for a quick sandwich. I'd go there every other day for lunch. It was one of those places where the staff knew my usual order. A foot long on Italian herb and cheese with turkey, no pickles, extra olives. I liked that it was predictable, no surprises, or so I thought. This one day, I got there a bit later than usual, closer to 2 p.m. The lunch rush was long over, and the place was almost empty. The usual guy behind the counter, Carlos, wasn't there. Instead, there was this new guy, someone I hadn't seen before. He looked a bit older, maybe mid-40s, with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed just a little too sunken in. Something about him gave me an uneasy feeling right away, but I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. Everyone has off days, right? I ordered my usual, trying to keep things casual. The guy, he didn't say much, just nodded and started making my sandwich. The way he moved was what got to me though. It was like he was moving in slow motion, but not in a relaxed way. More like he was measuring every step, every movement, like he was thinking too hard about it. It was off. As he was putting my sandwich together, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Not a lot, just a tiny tremor that made the knife he was using to slice the bread wobble a bit. He kept glancing up at me, his eyes darting around like he was nervous or something. It put me on edge, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just new, still getting the hang of things. When he handed me the sandwich, our eyes met for a second, and I swear I saw something in his expression that chilled me. It was like a mix of fear and anger, something dark, something he was trying to hide. I took the sandwich, mumbled a quick thanks, and found a seat at one of the tables near the window. As I sat there, unwrapping my food, I felt this weird tension in the air. The guy had gone back behind the counter, but I could still feel his eyes on me, watching me. It made my skin crawl. I kept my head down, focusing on my sandwich, but my mind was racing. Why was he staring at me like that? Had I done something to piss him off? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. There was one other person in the subway, a woman sitting at a table in the back. She was staring at her phone, completely oblivious to everything around her. I envied her in that moment, wished I could just tune out like that, but I couldn't. I was hyper aware of every sound, every movement, the hum of the soda machine, the soft rustle of napkins, as the guy behind the counter wiped something off. It was like my senses were on high alert. I forced myself to take a bite of the sandwich, trying to act normal. It tasted fine, just like it always did, but I couldn't enjoy it. My stomach was in knots, my heart racing. I felt like I was in a horror movie, waiting for something bad to happen. I kept glancing up, trying to catch the guy off guard, but every time I did, he was already looking at me. Not just looking, staring, with those cold, sunken eyes. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to seem rude or make a scene, so I ate as quickly as I could, barely tasting the food. I glanced around the room again, trying to find anything to focus on other than him. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a door at the back of the kitchen area, partially open. I'd never noticed it before. It wasn't the usual door to the storage room or the freezer. It was smaller, more like a closet door, and from where I was sitting, I could see just a sliver of what was inside. It looked dark, like there were no lights in there. I couldn't see much, just shadows and what seemed like a pile of something on the floor. My mind started to spiral, coming up with all sorts of crazy scenarios about what could be in there, but I kept telling myself to calm down, that I was overthinking it. It's just a storage room, I thought. Probably nothing. But then I saw him glance at the door, just for a second, and I swear his face changed. It was quick, barely noticeable, but there was this flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't tell, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I decided I'd had enough. I wrapped up the rest of my sandwich, shoved it into the paper bag, and stood up. I tried to act casual as I walked to the trash can, but my hands were shaking. I tossed the bag in and made my way to the door, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Just as I reached for the door handle, I heard a noise. It was faint, but in the silence of that place, it sounded like a gunshot. I froze, my hand on the handle, my eyes wide. It wasn't a gunshot, it was something else. A thud, like something heavy being dropped on the floor. I turned my head just a little, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the guy standing there, looking at me with this expression that was somewhere between a smirk and a scowl. I couldn't stay there any longer. I yanked the door open and practically ran out into the street. The fresh air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, my mind racing, my heart pounding. What the hell was that? What was in that room? And why was he looking at me like that? I got back to my office, but I couldn't concentrate on work. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. The guy's weird behavior, the door, the noise. None of it added up. I wanted to tell someone, but what could I say? Hey, I think the guy at Subway is hiding something creepy in the back room. It sounded ridiculous. For the next few days, I avoided that Subway. I went to other places for lunch, took different routes to and from work, just so I wouldn't have to walk past it. But it kept gnawing at me, the not knowing. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, let my mind play tricks on me. Then, one night, I was up late, browsing the internet, when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a local news article about a missing person, a young woman last seen at a Subway downtown. There was a photo of her, taken from the security camera at the Subway, the same Subway I went to. The date was from a few weeks before my weird encounter. I felt sick. The article didn't say much, just that she was last seen entering the Subway and hadn't been seen since. The police were investigating, but there were no leads. My mind went back to that small door, to whatever was behind it. Could it be related? Was that what I heard that day? Something to do with her? I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I should tell someone, but I was scared. Scared of what might happen if I got involved. Scared of what I might find out. But I couldn't just do nothing. So, the next day, I went to the police. I told them everything I saw, every detail I could remember. They listened, took notes, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. They probably thought I was some paranoid nut job. I left the station feeling more helpless than ever. Days went by, then weeks, and I didn't hear anything back. The news stopped covering the missing woman, and it seemed like the whole thing just faded away. But it didn't fade for me. I kept thinking about it, about her, about that door. Then, one evening, I was walking home from work when I passed by the subway. It was closed, dark inside, but something caught my eye. There was a piece of paper taped to the door. I walked closer to see what it was. It was a notice from the health department saying the place was shut down for violations. No details, just a generic notice. Part of me felt relief, but another part felt something else. Anger, maybe, or frustration, like it wasn't enough. Like whatever was happening there was just swept under the rug, never to be uncovered. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the darkened windows, trying to make sense of it all. I'll never know what really happened in that subway, what was behind that door, or if it had anything to do with the missing woman. But every time I pass by, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, this creeping dread that makes me quicken my pace and look straight ahead. Because some things are better left unknown, some doors better left closed, and sometimes the real horror is in the not knowing, in the dark corners of our minds that fill in the blanks with our worst fears.